Perfect. Thank you.
Yes.
So I think it's fine now. Only I can see my speaker notes. All right. So broadly, I think what we try to do in this chapter, we call it a world of responsible sport. And what we try to do is to sort of build a framework of uh, sports and human rights in which there is a sort of responsibility on the basis of human rights law, as well as instruments and guidelines on sports governing bodies and other actors in the sporting ecosystem in all their activities and operations and everything that they do, such that we reach a place where the entire ecosystem is a more responsible sort of ecosystem, with each actor having their own sort of set of responsibilities, and the stakeholders and the people who are affected have remedies. So it's sort of framework that sort of delineates the duties, the responsibilities, the duty holders, the responsibility holders on a broad human rights framework in the entire sporting ecosystem. So that's the overall idea. In terms of what we are going to talk today, sort of broadly divided in 7 parts, but sort of free-flowing in some ways. We start with discussing what we mean by responsible sport. What is our conception of responsible sport based on the developments that have happened in the world of business as well as in the world of sport and human rights, and the arguments that have been put forward to resist the idea that sport governing bodies should embrace human rights, and how we sort of counter those resistance in some ways. Then we move on to inherent links between sports and human rights, where we set out what the normative framework is of the existing human rights law and how that interacts with sports. Then we move on from there to talking about UNGPs as an authoritative framework, UNGPs being the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. We argue that they provide us a guiding framework for how we can build responsible sort of ecosystem in the sports and human rights space. And that is why, and how we are moving towards them, even though they're not authoritative in the sense that they're not binding law, they're still moving towards a space where they can be called an authoritative framework for thinking about these issues. Then we talk about MSCs as embedding human rights, in the sense that what are the current sort of ways in which mega sporting events, that is MSCs, have already, or major sporting events in some jurisdictions and some parts of the world, essentially Olympics, World Cups, and those sort of events which are huge and are at the pinnacle of the sport, respective sports in some ways. So to see how they've already started embedding human rights in some ways, and that also sort of significantly shows movement towards this idea of responsible sport. Then we talk about responsible sport beyond business relationships, in the sense that it's not just when sport governing bodies are acting in a commercial capacities that they have to comply with human rights laws and instruments, but also in their non sort of commercial capacity is that space also needs human rights compliance. So that is what we talk about in that. Then we move on to the more sort of thorny question of enforceability. We can have all the laws in the world, we can have all the guiding principles and sort of frameworks, but unless those laws, those remedies, and those frameworks can be enforced, all that talk of instruments and laws sort of remains hollow. So we talk about how we can sort of use the UNGP and the human rights framework to sort of enforce them against sport governing bodies. And then lastly, we conclude with a discussion on autonomy and specificity, and the idea that sports and sport governing bodies are autonomous. We agree that they are in most ways, but that does not mean that autonomy prevents us from moving towards a more sort of human rights responsible framework. And in fact, that should be seen as an opportunity rather than a challenge. So diving straight into it in the first section on the meaning of responsible sport, I think it starts with thinking about what responsible sports mean. Before that, the idea of responsibility in sport or business context is obviously not new. There have been a lot of specific and more ad hoc ideas of responsibility, responsible business conduct. But what we try to sort of bring out in this is the focus on UNGPs. So the UNGPs are the UN guiding principles, as I mentioned. As the name suggests, they're guiding principles and not necessarily an international covenant or a binding instrument. But what they tried to do, and they were sort of brought about in 2011, since in the last sort of decade or so and more than that, what they tried to do is to provide a social license for businesses to operate and essentially established a duty on states to protect, a corporate responsibility to respect human rights, and a collective duty to remedy harm, and an overall ongoing human rights due diligence duty on states as well as businesses. And a lot of sort of businesses as well as states are sort of moving towards an enforceable business and human rights framework, as we'll discuss in the later parts of this presentation. So that is the overall framework. And responsibility, sort of earlier, what it used to be associated with was notions of philanthropy, corporate social responsibility, or a shared value, stakeholder sort of value. But that framework has now started moving towards a more responsibility and legal liability sort of framework as a part of standard in contracts, in national legislations, and in international agreements. So we are seeing this movements, again, something that will be discussed in a bit more detail in later parts of the presentation. And where we sort of find this in a more sort of commercial and business context is the OECD guidelines. Again, as the name suggests, they are the guidelines, but they still have some enforceable framework in the form of the national contact points, which will again come to in more detail in later parts of the presentation. So the OECD guidelines sort of govern responsible business conduct generally, and responsible business. So that is where this idea sort of takes form in the business, and that's where we borrow these concepts from, the idea of responsibility in businesses. So what do we mean when we talk about responsible sport? How we define responsible sport is what we state here, which is that responsible sport is a world of sport. We are all institutional actors, by which we could mean the sport governing bodies, the international federations, the broadcasters, sponsors, suppliers, construction companies, all those, any actor which interacts with the sporting world and has a degree of control, has a degree of commercial relationship, is an institutional actor in the ecosystem. What we say is that all these institutional actors in the ecosystem respect human rights, prevent human rights harms, and address harms in accordance with existing and emerging international human rights law and standards. We try to be as broad as possible in this definition, as well as a bit forward-looking, in the sense that we also sort of think about emerging international human rights law standards, and broad in the sense of the same respect, protect, and fulfill framework of the UNGPs, which is a broader conception of human rights. So that is the idea of responsible sport. It sort of aligns with other values, as I said, of stakeholder capitalism. Again, nothing new. Stakeholder capitalism has been an idea that has been discussed for over 2 centuries, since the advent of the corporate form of ownership. But again, it ties in with those ideas and sort of notions of businesses not being just for their stakeholders, but more for the wider society and the wider stakeholders. And the idea is that when we engage in responsible sport, we mainstream a human rights-based approach to sport, by which we mean that we take everyone on board, all the affected parties, which could include the athletes, the fans, the local communities where sport events are organized, and anyone else who is affected by any sporting event or sporting activity. We sort of take them on board in this journey. We take their views on board if they're going to be affected. We figure out how best, if at all any harm occurs, that can be remedied. And how the overall sort of sporting event or sporting activity can lead to the best results for all the stakeholders as well as the affected people. So that is the idea of sport being responsible in some ways. Moving on to the next section on the inherent links between sports and human rights, uh, we talk about the fact that sport governing bodies have already started um, embedding human rights in some ways, in the sense of their policies on inclusion, on integrity, which is the whole sort of notion of sport being fair, and their governance principles as well, right? In their internal governance, which is off the field, but still notions of sort of responsibility, notions of good governance have already started, and these have been there for a long time now in both the sort of IOC agenda on good governance as well as different sporting governing bodies. So there are these references to responsibility that already exist. And so we can see that there are inherent links between sports and human rights in some ways, which have been there for a very long time. Uh, when we talk about sport, we also should not lose sight of the fact, and this is again something that has been mentioned in some earlier presentations today, that sport is a powerful cultural expression, right? It just doesn't restrict itself to what happens on the field. Sport can lead to a lot more in the wider society. It is a mirror to what the society is, but it is also a sort of window to the larger society, and it can sort of act as a catalyst to what can happen in the wider society and sort of guide where the society can move and how the society can progress. So in this sort of spirit, the UN bodies such as the Human Rights Council, the UN General Assembly, and various special rapporteurs have spoken about sports' role in the promotion of human rights. So, for instance, the Human Rights Council's resolution in 2019 on the elimination of discrimination against women and girls in sport spoke about the role of sport in enabling a less discriminatory and a more equal environment for women and girls. The HRC resolution also spoke about this. This is something I'll come to in a later slide because it's more relevant there. But this HRC resolution is very recent, in 2022, in fact. Special rapporteurs, again, this is a 2022 report of the special rapporteurs on two special rapporteurs in the field of cultural rights and in the field of contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia. Both of them noted that sport governing bodies should commit themselves to protecting and respecting internationally recognized human rights, and also spoke about how the UNGPs provide a framework for that. So we are seeing that the wider sort of world outside sport has also human rights world has started talking about this. And then more specifically in the sport sort of sense, we have the sporting chance principles, which were developed by the Advisory Council of the Center for Sports and Human Rights, which has a broad coalition which brings international governments, organizations, sport bodies, athletes, host sponsors, broadcasters, civil society representatives, trade unions, sort of broad coalition agreeing to a shared commitment that human rights in and through sport is something that we should aim for. So that is also something that shows this inherent link between sports and human rights. And as we have seen in the past few years, but overall in a lot of previous decades, but more specifically in the past few years, that sports has a lot of human rights risks and violations, which include, I'll not necessarily go into specific details or examples, but we all know about these in terms of the mental and physical and sexual abuse of athletes, gender discrimination, racial and homophobic abuse, detention of athletes who are protesting, and a lot more. And as we know, again, from the intense discussion that have happened over the past few years, particularly in the last 2 decades, that mega sporting events highlight these risks. We have seen a lot of risks to labor, to migrant workers, to people from marginalized communities in specific mega sporting events, Olympics and FIFA World Cups recently, and also the aspect of sports washing. again being highlighted specifically in relation to certain countries and certain authoritarian regimes as to how they're using the element of sports and their power of capital to launder their image and trying to sort of portray something else. So there is that link, and human rights sort of frameworks provide us to sort of counter those uh, those risks and those attempts. So there is this inherent link which we have spoken about. Moving on to UNGPs as an authoritative framework. Um, as I mentioned, the UNGPs are guiding principles and not necessarily hard law. And that is one of the initial sort of criticisms or responses whenever we talk about UNGPs or any such sort of framework in terms of guiding action, is that they are soft law and not legally binding or enforceable. So this is the sort of pushback that has been received in terms of UNGPs being applicable to sport governing bodies. We have received these sort of comments both publicly and privately from various sport governing bodies in terms of the fact that they're not hard law, the fact that sport is different from and more than just conducting business. So how can a framework that applies to businesses apply to sports? And the fact that sport is autonomous and should not be subject to undue external influence. The idea that sport and sport governing bodies are enjoy this special autonomy and they sort of self-contain within that structure. Agree, all those things. Indeed, that is true, and we cannot sort of say that that is not true, obviously. But as we said, uh, something that I'll discuss later is the fact that there is this trend towards responsible sport, right? Um, some illustrations of that in this slide. The fact that SGBs, sport governing bodies, are commercial actors, particularly when they're organizing mega sporting events. So at least in those capacities, when they are commercial actors, we can bring in the element of UNGPs. So that is one, that is the low sort of hanging fruit in some ways. The other one is the whole sort of legitimacy crisis of SGB governance and mega sporting events. Again, something that has been visible in the past 2 decades or so. A lot of sport governing bodies have seen uh, allegations of corruption. There, a lot of events have seen allegations of abuses and human rights. So there is this legitimacy crisis. And again, a responsibility-based framework and a human rights-based framework can sort of help in countering those issues of crisis and legitimacy. Uh, the idea is not necessarily to say that this is hard law and you should follow it, but to provide a framework that can help in understanding and engaging and acting better. So it's not just guidelines and that you have to follow them, but a broad framework which can help them how to sort of comply with certain things and how to be more responsible. And a lot of work that has been done by a lot of organizations, the Institute of Human Rights in Business, the Center of the Sport Rights Alliance, the World Players Association, and Shift. All of these have sort of guided the IOC, the FIFA, and other organizations in recent sort of history, and they have adopted frameworks which are based on UNGPs, which again show that UNGPs is emerging as an authoritative framework in their human rights policies, in their various interactions with the world of sports and human rights. We've also seen mentions to UNGPs and a broad human rights framework in the UN resolution, as I mentioned earlier. This is the resolution A77L28 of 2022, where the General Assembly explicitly stated that sport governing bodies must respect international laws and principles, particularly UNGPs, at every stage of the event life cycle. Already mentioned about the special rapporteurs. The Kazan Action Plan, again, something which was sort of adopted by sports ministers from various nations, spoke about UNGPs. The Europe Committee of Ministers again spoke about this, not necessarily to go into the details for all these, but the broad idea being that there is this movement towards UNGPs being sort of accepted as a framework which can guide these discussions. So moving on to a more specific discussion on how mega sporting events, which are broadly commercial events by any scale, are already embedding human rights. So, as I already mentioned, that the human GPs and OECD guidelines have a close sort of connection in that sense. So, not going into the detail for that, but we have seen that MSCs and sport governing bodies have received much more scrutiny in the past 2 decades or so, particularly since Beijing was chosen to host the 2008 Summer Olympics, given China's sort of record on human rights and other sort of being a closed country, and very few people know what is exactly going inside the country. And since then, we have seen a lot of developments, which is the positive bit, and which sort of holds the good sort of notions for the future. So starting with Vancouver 2010, which was the first Olympic or a mega sporting event that at that scale, which had a policy of sustainable procurement and provided for human rights obligations for suppliers, which had sort of become a standard in all future Olympics. Since then, we had London 2012, Sochi 2014, Rio 2016, and Pyongyang 2018, all summer and winter Olympic Games, which promoted awareness of the UN Declaration on Human Rights and other human rights-based instruments through their messaging during the games before and after as well. London 2012, again, something that they did, which is very specific, which has been a model for some future mega sporting events, is that they developed practices in relation to sustainable sourcing, as well as a bespoke grievance mechanism, which was quite good and has been adopted by later games as well. Then we saw in Glasgow 2014 Commonwealth Games and Gold Coast 2018 Commonwealth Games, as well as the recent games in Birmingham in 2022, an explicit adoption of human rights policy, which was aligned with the UNGPs, which again moved this discussion forward in terms of UNGPs and broadly human rights being embedded in MSc practices. A bit forward-looking as well, Paris 2024 Olympic Games have adopted a social charter which speaks about the rights of migrant workers and about the local community, which is yet to be seen how it will be operationalized, but that's quite positive. The next Men's Football World Cup of 2026, sorry for the typo there, will also likely be much more human rights compliant in the sense that it has adopted a human rights policy specifically quite detailed, which has sections that discuss various affected groups and their rights and their remedies and how those will be taken care of during, before and after the event. We'll see how that works, but so far so positive. We've also seen changes in bidding and hosting regulations in major sporting events from FIFA, UEFA, IOC, and other sport governing bodies, where now human rights due diligence is already a part of the bidding process. The changed IOC regulations as well, which is not necessarily bidding, but a more sort of consultative framework, also have that idea to sort of see the potential impact on human rights. And the hosting contracts also have human rights clauses and labor clauses which speak about a responsible framework, so to suggest. And we've also seen changes through statutory and policy commitments by various organizations, the adoption of the human rights policies by several organizations, including the FIFA, the IOC's recent strategic framework on human rights, the Commonwealth Games Federation, now known as Commonwealth Sport. All of them have adopted certain frameworks. So we've seen that MSCs are already embedding human rights, and more particularly UNGPs in some ways. So moving on to the sort of non-commercial aspects in some ways, and how, irrespective of whether sport governing bodies are engaging in a commercial activity or not, they are still sort of better off by complying with some notion of human rights and the responsible sport framework. We have seen that some international federations, I've named the most prominent, the FIFA, Commonwealth Games Federation, and IOC, have recently sort of adopted human rights policies, as I already mentioned, which do not only target their mega sporting events or their commercial functions, but also other parts of their operations, which include their management, their governance, how they sort of interact with grassroots sports and day-to-day sports. So it's a more sort of comprehensive frameworks. We also see some national federations engaging with this, in particular the German Football Federation, which in the past 2 years has adopted a human rights policy as well as a human rights due diligence requirement in its statutes, which means that any activity that it sort of uh, engages in, including broad events, but also day-to-day governance, management, operations, and day-to-day sports will be human rights compliant. So we see those sort of movements as well, which take care of the sort of commercial and non-commercial distinction as well in some ways. But now coming to the more sort of specific and more difficult question of enforceability, there are some trends which help us in enforceability as well, which is why the overall framework works. So firstly, talking about the fact that the UNGPs are being crystallized into hard law through legislations in various countries. For instance, the modern slavery law legislation in the UK and Australia, the Dutch child labor due diligence law, which again imposes a duty on businesses to conduct specific due diligence in relation to issues of child labor, the French law on the duty of due diligence and vigilance, which is again about responsible business conduct. Switzerland's initiative on responsible business is again a similar sort of law. Then we have the Germany's law on corporate due diligence and supply chains. European Union's taxonomy regulation, which imposes specific due diligence requirements in relation to human rights during financial sort of transactions. And again, EU's mandatory due diligence regulation, which should be adopted sometime this year at the broader EU level as well. One specific thing which might come as a question at this stage is the fact that most of the countries mentioned here, in fact, all of them almost except Australia, are based in Europe. And that is not necessarily an issue given the fact that most sport governing bodies at the international level are based in Europe. So if these sort of regulations come by in Europe, they will apply to those sport governing bodies. And then they will trickle down through them to the national sort of bodies and other bodies. And also the fact that it can start in some parts of the world means that these sort of laws will be adopted in other parts of the world as well. This is a start, and that's what is positive, and we should look forward to future developments in other parts of the world as well. Similarly, UNGPs are also being crystallized into hard law through case laws. Several cases in UK and the US and Canada have seen UNGPs being relied on by interveners and complainants to argue that corporates have violated their human rights, and courts are more open to sort of using those arguments to hold corporates liable. More specifically, the Shell case in the Netherlands has seen a Dutch court impose obligations on Royal Dutch Shell to reduce its carbon emissions. And a lot of these developments will come through climate change law and climate change actions, which have been going on quite a lot. And we are seeing every new week, we have a more specific climate change action coming in different parts of the world, which will develop the law in this regard. And those can be adopted in sport governing body cases as well. As I mentioned earlier, UNGPs are being referenced in hosting and supplier contracts by various sport governing bodies already, and by various broadcasters, suppliers, and sponsors. Specifically in relation to OECD guidelines, something that I referred to earlier, they have enforcing mechanisms in the form of national contact points. And two specific cases from the national contact points in the UK and Switzerland have seen changes happening specifically in relation to Formula One's obligation during the Grand Prix in Bahrain, and a case that was brought by the Building and Woodworkers International Broad Coalition of Workers against Qatar, in which Qatar agreed to sort of comply with certain directions and improve the rights for migrant workers in Qatar. I see that I'm sort of reaching that half hour stage, and I'll just be quickly sort of finishing up in the next 2 minutes and take questions after that. Sorry for this slight extension. Just sort of broadly concluding on the point of what we see now and where do we move forward from this, and should human rights and UNGPs and this framework be seen as a challenge or an opportunity? As we have seen, a lot of prominent sport governing bodies have already started incorporating these practices in their frameworks, in their policies, through years of advocacy by rights groups, by a lot of affected people. And we have to be thankful to all of them, and the fact that they have been going ahead and doing this for so many years and decades. And that is how these organizations have agreed to these changes, obviously. So obviously acknowledging all that. But the fact that there are still some organizations at different sort of levels and at different stages across the globe, which talk about the fact that essentially sport governing bodies are non-commercial entities. They are mostly incorporated as trusts or societies or private entities or charities. And then these regulations might not specifically apply to them. And also the fact that sport governing bodies have this autonomy in their governance, again, something that we have already spoken about. And which is why we, within the responsible sport framework, we talk about responsible autonomy, in the sense that autonomy doesn't mean that you can be totally independent of everything that goes on in the wider world. Autonomy means that within the sporting framework, you can decide, but that autonomy still has to be tempered with the ideas of good governance, human rights. And a lot of international organizations, as well as some sport governing bodies, have acknowledged that autonomy has to be tempered with the ideas of good governance and responsibility. And they have to agree to the fact that their operations can lead to negative human rights impacts and risks. And this is just a normal part of everyday operations of any business or any entity that engages in any activity. And the idea with these frameworks and these guidelines is to sort of conduct proper due diligence before, after, during, and an ongoing basis to ensure that harms are prevented. But if harms occur, then proper remedies are available for those harms. And again, the idea of autonomy, as we said, is not necessarily sort of restrictive, because we have seen interference with autonomy to ensure legal compliance in a lot of different countries, ranging from across the globe. USA has seen multiple acts which have upheld the rights of athletes. The recent act on equal pay for athletes in the United States, again, is an example of that, where the sort of US Senate and the Congress, they agreed to a law to ensure equal pay. Australia and Canada have regulations which prevent discrimination against transgender athletes, which might mean that even if an international organization brings about restrictive guidelines, they cannot be applied in Australia and Canada. India has seen a lot of intervention by the courts and by the governments to ensure good governance in sport governing bodies in terms of their internal operations. South Africa has transformation regulations adopted as recently as 2011, which ensure equal participation of athletes from different backgrounds in their sporting teams. And we have seen a lot of sort of push towards advanced ESG, DI norms broadly. And this push is likely to continue, and this push is likely to sort of lead us to a more responsibility-based framework on emerging human rights laws and standards. That's all from me. I'll stop. I've spoken quite a lot. Look forward to discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. If others don't have questions, if anybody has any questions. All right, great. Yvonne? Yvonne, do you want to go ahead?
Yes.
Great.
We loved your topic so much about responsible sport that we used it as the theme for our conference. All right. I don't know if you realized that, but
Yeah.
we did. We just loved it. We started off the day with speakers from Malaysia talking about the importance of governance. And it's wonderful to come back here later in the day where you're talking about it. Your mention of sports washing, I don't know if that's a concept that a lot of people here know, but it's a very important one. And it applies directly to how the governments are using sport to either advance authoritarian regimes or democratic ones. And so what you have to say is so very important. And I just wanted to personally thank you, and share that. And if you would like to talk more about that, but I think that Sarah has some questions too, but we just love it. So thank you.
No, thank you so much. It's very, very good to hear that you liked it so much. And I didn't notice the fact of the title of the conference.
I do have a couple of questions. Particularly, I mean, I'm a football follower along with my husband, and when FIFA awarded Qatar the World Cup in 22, there were a lot of concerns, and I think that they were justified. But knowing that, you've got these mega sports events, how do, and we know that Qatar violated a lot of human rights. What is the legal remedy to this? I mean, we're not going to have another Qatar World Cup. So, how is the remedy achieved legally?
Right. Thank you. Very important question. And I always think the essential question is about enforcement and remedy in all cases. Yeah. And absolutely true. So I think few things that we need to keep in mind with respect to Qatar is one, that when the World Cup was awarded in 2010, we did not have UNGPs. We did not have a broader notion of human rights sort of applying to sport governing bodies. We did not have any of the current policies that these organizations have adopted in terms of human rights. We did not have the current hosting and bidding requirements, which require that you should have human rights built into the framework of these events before, during, and after the event. So given that context, which is a very important context, and probably that is also something that accelerated these developments over the past 12 or 13 years, since the sort of award of Qatar and Beijing 2008. The question of remedy, I think, is quite complicated, and also particularly in respect of Qatar, and more so in respect to the migrant workers. We have seen campaigns from Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, which they have asked for the remedy for those migrant workers who have been affected by the event. Which is why I think all the work that a lot of these civil society organizations have done around, and particularly the ILO, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, the center has also sort of worked a lot in bringing these broad coalitions together, BWI, and trying, and as well people in the Supreme Committee as well, who have really pushed hard the agenda and made. I know there is a lot to be done and a lot has not been done, but also a lot has been done in that sense. And the difficulty with Qatar is that internationally, there is very little that could be done at an enforcement level in that sense, because where are the obligations? Because these obligations did not exist at that stage, which is why the idea has been to try to make the Supreme Committee of the which organized the World Cup and the state of Qatar adopt certain sort of non-binding regulations, but sort of self, in the sense that they should do it themselves rather than because that there is a legal obligation. And also FIFA, which is why the Amnesty campaign is targeted at FIFA in some ways. So I think that is why it becomes important to have these legal obligations built in the hosting, the bidding, and through various channels and various contractors, sponsors, broadcasters, and suppliers, before the event is sort of granted.
Yeah.
So I don't think I have an answer to what can happen with Qatar and what hasn't happened. We can only hope that we continue to push for it, and a lot more hard work that the civil society organizations are doing. And at some stage, FIFA and the Supreme Committee and different organizations can come together and give remedies to all those people who deserve that. Uh, and we take all the lessons that we have learned from this experience, right? Where the loopholes were, where the plugs, where the gaps were, and how we can plug them in future events, which is the broad endeavor, and that's where we're moving towards. So I think that is what it is. This sort of idea is more forward-looking in that sense, and I don't. I don't think I have the expertise or the sort of mandate to speak about Qatar that much, because
If you're talking about, I'm going to push you a little bit on this. If you're talking about something like Paris and a social charter, I mean, would before a mega sporting event, which is, really a business, setting aside the ideal of sport, it's really a business. It's to create, money for a lot of people, particularly the country that it's in. I mean, is there like a legally binding contract that if they put forward a bid, that they are going to comply with these human rights and also other rights such as climate policies and sustainability? I mean, can you not put the legally binding part at the very beginning before they even get the bid?
yes. So that is in fact what I mean by the bidding and hosting regulations and the change that has happened. So Paris 24 and LA 28 in terms of Olympics, and the United 2026 and Australia New Zealand 2023, in fact, which will be the most upcoming World Cup, the Women's World Cup. These are the first events in the Olympic and the FIFA category, the first sort of events in the Olympic and the FIFA, which already have those human rights commitments built into their hosting contracts, because those were a part of the bidding requirements. So in case of Paris, for instance, it will be much more easier to sort of obtain remedy for human rights violations, because the bidders for Paris 24 and the organizing committee have agreed to specific human rights commitments in their hosting regulations and the hosting contracts. So as you said, exactly that is what has happened. And the idea now is to sort of make these commitments more comprehensive and bring in an element of climate justice, as you mentioned, which I am not entirely sure if that already exists, or if it exists indirectly through reference to other sort of human rights broadly. But that's the idea now, to sort of make these human rights commitments more comprehensive, to incorporate various different possibilities of risks and abuses, and more so on the prevention side rather than on the remedy side, of course, but both have to go on simultaneously. And also to take these commitments to a larger pool of events occurring in different parts of the world and organized by different organizations. So that is the endeavor, and that's what we are moving towards. And the fact that these can be incorporated within SGB regulations more broadly mean that they'll automatically fall into the hosting regulations alongside other broader agenda as well. So yeah, that is where we are sort of advocating for.
Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time, Yvonne, if that's correct. But I just have one more point that I'd like to make. I mean, we talk about the equal pay for women's soccer in the United States. Well, you may know or not know that we don't have a law that says that women, we don't have the Equal Rights Amendment that says that women have to be paid equally as a legally binding factor. And I wonder if you can, like in 2 sentences, talk about how the possibility of creating this justice in sports might be a leader for other kinds of social justice and human rights. Like, I'd love to have an ERA, right? So, I mean, is it possible? I think if you understand my question, can we not, is it possible to use these advances in sport to be an example of some changes further on in other areas?
No, absolutely agree with that. And definitely that is also something that we should advocate for, and we should speak about as to how, because I think what happens with sport is that it's not just a mirror, it's also a more amplified mirror, in the sense that whatever happens in the society happens more in a more sort of drastic fashion in sport, and the inequalities and the disadvantages and the violations are visible in a more drastic fashion, which is why I think sports can be used as a means to sort of show that these problems exist in sports as well as a society. And if we can figure out a way to solve these in sports, maybe we can
Yes.
figure out a way to solve this in society as well, and vice versa, of course, depending on the specific context.
Shining light that goes on these, mega sporting events that might, make it more accessible to people and understanding the problems that we face. Okay,
Absolutely.
well, fascinating. Thank
Thank
you,
you so much.
Shubham. It's really been I'm not a huge understander of all of this, and certainly not of law, but this has really been very educational for me.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. So Yvonne, I think our session is finishing. Is that correct?
That's right. And we'll take a short break and then we'll get ready for the next session.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you both so much.